We'll take a look down into the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. So the spinal cord itself is our connection between the brain and the peripheral nervous system. So this is going to be the way that we have the majority of all of our nerves exiting and going out to the rest of the body and controlling things that are there and sending sensory information back to the central nervous system and motor information back out. When we look at the cord itself, we can see that it kind of has an H pattern to it. And so the gray matter that is inside has that distinctive pattern to it there. It has two big depressions in it. And so we have a posterior median sulcus, and we have an anterior median fissure. So the fissure is going to be a little bit wider than that of the sulcus. The cord runs all the way from the foramen magnum all the way down to about L1. And as we started to see it coming along through the cord itself, we have areas where we can see little rootlets starting to emerge from the cord as it is there, and this is a posterior view there. So we have posterior rootlets, so this is going to be sensory information. On the anterior side, we're going to see anterior rootlets, and these are going to be motor information that's coming from there. And as essentially the sensory information comes in, the motor information can go back out, and we can do things like reflexes. The cord itself is divided up into the same regions as we have for the bones. So we have cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal regions on there. So that gives us 31 pairs of nerves all in all. For the cervical region, this is the one where it does not follow that of the bones because we have 8 cervical nerves, and yet we only have 7 cervical vertebrae. All the rest are going to follow the same pattern. We have 12 thoracics, we have 5 lumbar, we have 5 sacral, and then coming down along through the coccygeal, although we only have 1 bone as an adult, and same thing really goes for the sacrum, but the sacrum did originate as 5 individual bones there. The coccyx has 1 pair of nerves on the bottom there. And so that gives us our 31 separate pairs. The cord itself ends at about L1, and it comes down, and where it ends is in the conus medullaris. So it creates kind of a cone shape here as it comes down. The solid cord is above that region there, and then what remains is a series of fibers. And so this is what we call the phylum terminale. And so we have no actual cord in here, but we do have nerve fibers. And those nerve fibers of the cauda equina are going to bring sensory and motor information down into the lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal region that's there. The cord does have the same kinds of coverings to it as that of the brain. So we have a dura mater, an arachnoid mater, and a pia mater. And the pia mater here, coming out of the conus medullaris, creates a slight extension of that pia mater, and it goes all the way from the conus medullaris all the way down into this kind of lighter fiber that's here, all the way down to the coccyx, and this is what's called the phylum terminale. So this phylum that comes out of there is going to anchor the cord essentially at the coccyx itself, and so it's going to stop it from moving up and down the cord. So I mentioned that we have all of the same meninges that we had for the brain. So we have a dura mater, an arachnoid mater, and a pia mater are the innermost coverings to the brain itself. And similar to that of the brain, we also then have our vertebral column. We have assorted muscles that run along the vertebral column, and then skin and hair and things like that as well covering it. Similar to that of the brain as well, we do have some different spaces that are available as well. And so in between each layer that is there, we have our subdural space. We then have our subarachnoid space that is there. In between the vertebral column and the dura mater itself, we then have the epidural space. This is where things like epidurals are going to go. The spinal cord is divided up into gray and white matter, similar to that is of the brain as well again. And again, we have for the gray matter, it makes kind of an H pattern or almost like a butterfly type of a pattern in terms of its shape there. If you fill it all out into the wings and everything there. And that gray matter is then divided into an anterior horn, a posterior horn, and then a lateral horn. So we have three separate regions that are there. The anterior horns are sending all information for motor. The posterior horns are sensory. And then those lateral horns carry sympathetic nervous system information. That's there. The white matter then is all the region that is not the gray matter. So everything outside of the gray matter itself. So all of this region in here is all of our white matter. And so that's going to be all the components that are out in there. So the white matter, just like the brain, is myelinated fibers. And in the case of the brain, this is information that is traveling either, in a sense, up or down the cord. So it's either ascending information or descending information as it comes through the cord itself. And within that, we have different regions where that information is going to travel within the white matter. And so we have what we call the posterior funiculus, and then we have the lateral funiculus, and then we have the anterior funiculus. And so all of this is white matter that is connecting information going up and down the cord as it is needed. All along the cord, we then have our spinal nerves. And so these are going to come out at the regions where we have openings to the intervertebral foramen. And so those spinal nerves are going to exit at the intervertebral foramens there. And they exit with either the dorsal roots or the ventral rootlets here. And those dorsal and ventral rootlets are going to join together to give us the actual roots. And then the roots are going to join together to give us the mixed spinal nerve that actually exits the cord itself. And so each portion of the root is going to exit there. And again, on the anterior side, we have motor information. On the posterior side, we have sensory information. And on the posterior side as well, where that sensory information is coming in, we have here what's called the dorsal root ganglion. It almost looks like a swelling of the dorsal root that is there. And this is where those cell bodies of all of that sensory information is coming in. The anterior side for motor, all of those cell bodies for motor lie within the anterior horn. Since each of the spinal nerves exit the cord at distinctive levels, we can map out essentially where each of those levels go out to the skin and innervate the skin as well. And so when we do that, we have what we call dermatomes. And so the dermatomes themselves essentially innervate a specific segment of the skin itself. And as you can see in the pictures, especially through the torso, you have a very distinctive kind of pattern where everything is lined up into a specific kind of a line there as it moves along. But then even into the arms and legs, they even have their own specific areas as well. And so if somebody's having dysfunction somewhere along their spinal cord, or even just maybe their first symptoms are somewhere out on their body in terms of where they're experiencing those symptoms, we can kind of see where that particular issue is. And so if it was, say, somewhere on the hand in the palm there, kind of on the thumb side, we may start to look at C6 as being potentially that root cause of the problem itself. If they were having problems over in their pinky side, and so along the fifth digit and then along into the ring finger, you would then be looking at information that may be coming down from C8. And so we're going to be looking for those different areas and testing in those different areas to see where the potential problem is. Each of the groups of nerves, as they come out, tend to go to different areas of the body as well. And as they do so, they're going to tend to kind of mix together. And so what we have is what we call a plexus. And so these nerve plexuses are essentially mixing of information from the anterior and the posterior rami. And so we're going to take information in that is going to kind of blend the information together within the components that are there. And so we're going to take this information that is going to supply a particular area, and it's going to go into specific areas of the body itself. And so the anterior rami are going to innervate those areas that are going to places like the limbs, and so your arms and legs. They're going to be going to the anterior parts of the entire trunk, and so our entire torso there for that. And then the posterior side is going to be basically doing the posterior side of the body itself. And so this is going to be doing essentially everything that is on the back of the body. So those anterior rami are going to come together and give us these nerve plexi. And so the plexuses themselves are essentially where we're blending the information together. And so as we do so, we're going to take information from C1 here, and we're going to send some of that information down. And then some of C2's information is going to blend into it. And then C2 is going to send some information down as well. And then that's going to blend into C3 and so on. So we're kind of blending all of the information from these different levels themselves. And so this particular case, this is the cervical plexus. And so this is supplying all of the cervical region of the spinal nerves themselves. And then we have a brachial plexus for the arms, and then we have a lumbar and sacral plexus for the legs. One of the more important nerves that originates from the cervical plexus is the phrenic nerve. Phrenic nerve has roots that arise from C3, 4, and 5. And it's important because, as the saying goes, C3, 4, and 5 keeps the diaphragm alive. And so the phrenic nerve is going to innervate the diaphragm. So it's what's going to allow the diaphragm to function. So if there's any kind of spinal cord injury to C5, C4, C3, we're going to have weakening and weakening function of the diaphragm. And anything above C3, so a C2 injury, C1 injury, is going to cause the diaphragm to no longer function. The reflexes are there for allowing our body to very quickly respond to a stimulus. And so that stimulus is oftentimes going to be something that is potentially dangerous to the body. And so that potential danger could be something like physical danger. You've touched something hot or sharp or something like that, and so on. And that allows for the immediate response. We don't have to think about it. It's unconscious and it's automatic. And the big thing is that it happens the exact same way every single time. So it's a expected response that is there for that. Some of our reflexes themselves are able to be overridden sometimes, and so we can kind of suppress the reflexes at times at certain components. We can try and use the muscles or think about using the muscles, and that can kind of alter how that reflex may work. The actual reflex is going to essentially have the ability to cause muscle contraction before conscious awareness actually occurs. And so when the reflex begins, the actual awareness component is after the reflexive action. And so we don't want to have the cortex essentially weigh in on the matter before that process occurs. And so essentially the timing wise, is that the reflex is going to come into the cord and it's going to go immediately back out into the motor side. It's going to skip sending information up to the cortex, so we're not going to necessarily know that it happened until after it's done. But we're talking about milliseconds in time, so to us it's essentially immediate. It has perceptively, we feel the hot pot or something like that, and we immediately pull away. But in terms of the reflex, that reflex was already working before we ever knew that the painful stimulus was actually there. If we have damage to a reflex, or in terms of the reflex not responding the way that it should, we may have either a hypoactive reflex or a hyperactive reflex. And so the hyporeactive reflex is where you go to the doctors, they tap on, say, your patellar tendon, and you're expecting your knee to go into extension and kick, and you get very little kick. A hyperactive reflex is where you tap on that tendon and it kicks really, really strong. The most important thing when kind of looking at the components of a reflex is that, is it similar to the other side? And so do they truly have a hypo or hyperactive reflex, or is it the same on the other side? And granted, that really only tells us that both sides are either equally weak or equally strong as well. So the basic reflex arc itself is going to involve a process where we're causing some sort of stimulus that requires us to respond to it. And so in this case, we have a receptor, and that receptor is sending information along a sensory neuron. It comes into the cord. It synapses on an interneuron, and this interneuron is all that we do for processing. That's the minimal amount of processing that occurs. And then it immediately sends the information back out to the motor side of things, and we activate muscle control. And so this is going to cause something to occur. And so we think of reflex as being typically something like this, where it's a sensory and then a skeletal muscle type of a control that's there. And so with that, we usually think of it as being skeletal muscle, but it could also be something like a smooth muscle or a cardiac muscle or even a gland that is in the reflex arc itself. The reflex of something like touching a hot pot, something like that, is going to be a type of ipsilateral reflex. It happens on the same side as the stimulus. And so ipsilateral means same side. And so the receptor and the effector organ are on the same side. If you touch it with your right hand, you're going to pull your right hand away, or your left hand, you pull your left hand away. A contralateral reflex is going to be when the sensory information is on one side of the body, but the motor control component is on the opposite side of the body itself. And so this can be something where we have kind of a situation, if you were to step on something sharp, say a Lego, one of the world's worst things to ever step on, especially with a bare foot, you're going to have to not only lift up the foot that is stepping on the Lego, but you're also going to have to move the other side down. And so this is going to be a crossed extensor type of a reflex. This is a contralateral reflex. This is going to involve the other side of the body as well. We then have things like monosynaptic reflexes, and so this is the simplest kind, and whereas our original example there showed an interneuron, these interneurons are not involved, and so there's no interneurons working within this process itself. Essentially, we're even more so taking that little bit of control out of the situation there. And so this is the same example as what I said before, in terms of you go to the doctors and they tap on your patellar tendon, and we're doing a patellar reflex. And so we're doing the process of looking to see whether those tendons are sending off the signals from the muscles themselves and allowing for that muscle to start to contract. And so the muscle sees that we're stretching it too quickly, And so that stretch reflex allows us to very quickly contract the muscle in response to it. Polysynaptic reflexes are going to involve those interneurons. And so this is going to be something like I described in terms of our crossed extensor type of a reflex, where this is going to involve stepping on something and then sending that information across to the other side as well. This is going to also be utilized when, in order to cause contraction of one set of muscles, we may also have to inhibit the other set. So if we're going to contract the quadriceps, we're going to have to inhibit the hamstrings at the same time. And so it's a little bit more involved. So it does take a moment for it to kind of get the process going. And so we can almost sometimes see a little bit of a delay in the response that is there. When that sensory information starts to come into the cord and that motor information goes down the cord itself, they travel through what are called tracts. And so tracts can be kind of thought of as being kind of like nerves, but within the spinal cord itself. And so this is either sensory information going up the cord or motor information coming down. When that occurs, this information is essentially kind of segregated into specific areas. And so the same kind of information is going to travel in the same areas, as well as being the same area of the body is going to send that information into the same specific space as well. And so that's going to kind of make sure that all the same kinds of information are getting to the same places within the brain, and then traveling to the right part of the cord as well when it's motor coming back down. So when it comes to information traveling through the cord, we have ascending pathways, and then we have our descending pathways. This is motor information and then sensory information. And so ascending pathways are always sensory information, descending is always motor. And since the information has to get to the opposite side of the cortex, at some point along the pathway, information is going to cross. And so we're going to have to get the information over to the other side. And so information that is within the cortex on the right side of the brain is either coming or going from information that is on the left side of the body, and vice versa. So most of the information is going to decussate. And so that information is going to be referred to as decussation. And so almost all of the pathways cross over. And so the majority of information is going to cross over. We're not going to keep it on the same side. Just like where the brain had a homunculus for the information traveling up to the brain and away from the brain, where we could kind of map out exactly where information was, the spinal cord actually has a similar thing where we call it somatotopy. And so it has a specific area of the cord is involved in a specific part of the body. And so we can kind of see where those particular areas themselves are. So on either side of the cord, we're going to have paired tracks. And so we're going to have information for the left side of the body and information for the right side of the body traveling on either side. The information as it travels up and down the cord is going to have not just a single neuron sending that information all the way from, in a sense, your skin all the way up to the brain. There's going to have to be synapses. And so with that, on the sensory side of things, we have 2 or 3 neurons involved. And so we're going to have either a primary, secondary, or tertiary, or a first order, second order, or third order neuron sending that information on up. On the motor side, we have 2. We have an upper motor neuron, and then we have a lower motor neuron. And depending upon where that information is coming from and going to, dictates kind of where those neurons cross over as well. So for sensory information, we need to have some sort of receptor. So we do have some free nerve endings, but for the majority of information coming up, we have receptors, and so they detect a specific type of stimulus. That specific type of stimulus then enters into the cord, and as it comes into the cord or the brainstem, if we're talking about a cranial nerve, that information is going to come in, and we're going to be able to kind of do a little bit of processing there. And so we're going to make sure that we need to know about that information in a sense. And so is that information that actually needs to be, should it be transmitted to the cerebrum? Or should we ignore it? Can we terminate that information? And so that happens in some cases where if the stimulus is constant, we're going to basically turn off that information sometimes. That's there. And so the majority of information is actually kind of ignored. And so we're not always being bombarded with all the information that comes into the spinal cord or the brainstem. Doesn't all make it up to the cortex, and we're not overwhelmed by all of this sensory input that's coming in. So for the first order neuron, this primary neuron, the dendrites connect to the receptor, and then the cell body is in the dorsal or posterior root ganglion, and its axon then travels into either the cord or the brainstem. The second order neuron then is sitting either in the spinal cord or in the brainstem, and so its neuron is sitting there. And so the cell body of our second order neuron is either in the dorsal horn of the cord or the brainstem nucleus for that particular cranial nerve that's there. It's then going to start to send its signal up towards the central nervous system. And so it's going to continue its pathway up towards the thalamus, and the thalamus then has its say in the matter in a sense, and then it synapses on our tertiary or third order neuron. This third order neuron then sends its information from the thalamus, where its cell body is, and that information is then going to go up towards the cortex, where we're going to essentially process all of the sensory information, and depending upon what kind of sensory information it is going to dictate which part of the cortex it ends up going to. So as an example here, we have information that is coming on up, and so this is going to be going through the medial lemniscus, and so this information as it travels up is traveling through the medial lemniscus, and so this is kind of our nerve within the spinal cord itself, as far as the information goes. And this sends up information about pretty much general sensation information. So this is going to be everything from conscious proprioceptive information, so our ability to know where our joints and muscles and things are at any given time, to information about touch, vibration, pressure on the skin itself. All of that kind of information travels up through this particular tract. And so the first order neuron comes in, and its cell body is within the dorsal root ganglion. That information is then going to travel for that particular neuron. It's going to travel on up, and it's going to synapse inside the medulla. That information of that second order neuron then starts to travel up. It crosses over within the brainstem and then comes on up to the thalamus. And then the third order neuron is going to get us out to the out to the cortex. For motor pathways, we have descending pathways, and again, this is going to be a 2-neuron process. And so for the most part, this information is going to be arising from, say, the primary motor cortex, and then sending its information down to the brainstem or the spinal cord. And so with this, we have 2 very important pathways. We have the direct and indirect pathways that are sending this descending information on down. And with this, some of the names of the tracks themselves follow a fairly easy naming scheme because they kind of tell us where they're coming from and where they're going to. And so corticospinal tells us that it's coming from the cortex and going to the spinal cord as far as the information goes. So it starts over here in the primary motor cortex, and then that upper motor neuron is going to send its signal down through the brainstem, and then that information is either going to cross over in the brainstem through the pyramids, or that information is going to continue on down and cross over at the cord level itself, and then send that information out. That upper motor neuron is going to synapse in the anterior horn of gray matter, and then the lower motor neuron is going to send its information out to the specific muscle as far as the contraction of that muscle needs to occur. And so that's going to get our information going out to the specific area of the body and control that particular motor unit. So our somatic motor control, so our skeletal muscle control, is essentially kind of within that primary and premotor cortex within the brain. But at the same time, there's other influences that come into play. And so we have essentially the frontal lobe making the decisions in the first place that we're going to move a specific muscle, that we're going to move that particular muscle depending upon where it is. And so that sends the plan over to our primary motor areas and our premotor areas. The cerebellum then has a large influence in it as well, in that it's going to make the final adjustments to the plan and either, in a sense, okay the plan or modify the plan as it sees fit so that we're able to maintain our balance and do the potential movement that we actually want to do. And so all these areas have to be kind of functioning properly in order to get the information to go where it is that we need it to go. And so we're going to influence all of those particular areas, and then eventually primary motor cortex is going to fire off, and our upper motor neuron is going to send its information on down, and the lower motor neuron down in the cord or the brainstem is then going to send its information out to the muscle itself and out to the particular specific muscle that is going to be influenced. So for motor control, we have kind of different levels of potential processing of the motor control that is there. And so when it comes to, say, a reflex, that reflex has the simplest, lowest level of motor control. Basically, we're controlling just a specific particular area of the body, and that sensory information comes in and goes right back out. And so it's going right back out to the specific area that is involved, and there's really no processing going on. It's either it happens or it doesn't for there. And so those different reflexes themselves have the ability to make those controls. At the cortical level, so up in the cerebrum, we have our highest level of control. This is our conscious control. This is where we're going to be able to override some of those movements and things that we may want to do, in a sense, that is there, depending upon the type of control that is needed at that particular area itself within the cortex itself. So when we have different types of information, so especially when it comes from and involves the brainstem and our cranial nerves, this is going to see a pattern of muscle or neuron firing that is fairly specific to what is going on. So as you listen to things and you start to listen to that information, our primary auditory cortex receives that information. We're going to interpret the language that is being spoken. We're going to figure out what those words and things like that mean for that. And Wernicke's area then, which interprets the language information itself, then is going to send that information over to the motor portion for speech. So if you were asked a question, say, the Wernicke's area would then fire over to motor speech area to prepare for saying those words, or if I asked you a question to say your name, the process itself then comes over to that premotor for language, which is over in the motor speech area there. And we're going to send that information then from motor speech up to primary motor cortex. And so we send that information up, primary motor cortex fires off, and then you're able to say the words that were being asked of you to say. For the processing of motor information and the processing of just general kind of things for the cerebrum, the two sides of the hemispheres don't specifically work the same. And this is especially so for language. And so language tends to be on the left side of the brain, so it tends to be in the left hemisphere itself. And so we have the information for motor speech areas, Wernicke's area, that's involved. We have the left side of the brain tends to be kind of the areas that follow patterns of things, and so science and mathematics and things like that, versus the right side of the brain tends to be more of the abstract, the art types of information that needs to be processed over on the right hemisphere. And so this is kind of the difference in terms of the information that's being processed there. So language tends to be only on the left side of the brain for most people. And so that tends to keep that kind of information over on that single side. So if somebody has damage to Wernicke's area because of a stroke or a closed head injury, something like that, they're going to have very difficult time being able to communicate on there. And so with the brain, we talked about the corpus callosum as being an area where we have white matter that crosses over between the two sides. And this is where we can start to get that information transferring from one side to the other within the brain itself as well. When we look at the cortex here, we have information that we can see as far as, say, the right hand. And so if we touch something with the right hand, the left cortex is going to, in a sense, feel it. It's going to respond to that particular information itself. Anything that is in the right side of the visual field is going to end up over on the left side of the cortex as well. And so that information comes over to that other side at the same time. And so here we can see the kind of specifics of information that is being processed over on that right side, or on the left side rather, and we see the very kind of specific patterned type of information versus kind of art and music and abstract types of things that are being processed over on the right side of the brain. For the brain to start to make more and more and more of those connections that it needs, we need to be able to basically take information from the short term and turn it into a long-term memory. And so just like with studying and working on information for being able to remember it in the long term, we have to utilize things that are going to allow us to remember them over the long haul, and doing things like practice, combining that sensory information with not only practice, but also combining it with, say, other memories, with feelings, with past experiences. All of this allows us to potentially get the information to go from short term over to long term. And so the more kind of pieces of information we can put together with a particular small piece of information, the better that we're going to be able to recall it later on. And so the more sensory neurons that and interneurons that are being activated during this process. This is why some people are more visual learners. They need to, or some people like to hear things more. All of that is the way that essentially the wiring or the components of mixing that information goes for that particular person. And that then allows them to remember the thing that is there. And so we can add it to other information. We can use things like mnemonics. We can use acronyms for that information. Something that has a feeling associated with it. We can have laughter, things that were funny or things that were sad or even things like that. Add to the overall ability to remember the information that is there. And hopefully you'll remember this information later on as well.